You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Brian Most and Don Davis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHX. I'm former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast called Supply Chain Secrets. Today, Don and I are going to do something a little different. Last week, we had a podcast that talked about what the heck is going on in container shipping. And we kind of debated about the title, Don, but it actually took off. People, I think that's how they characterize what's happening out there. But the cool thing is we got some amazing feedback and perspectives. And first of all, we want to thank the listeners for listening and providing their thoughts. And at the end of the day, Don and I aren't saying whether we're right or wrong. We're just giving opinions and thoughts and perspectives for discussion and debate. And based on that feedback, we're going to start talking about some of the comments that we get, whether it be through social media or directly back to us. And then we're actually going to start taking some topics, some thoughts and ideas from you around things that you want to hear about. And so today we're going to do that. We're going to talk about a couple of things that are in the headlines that are on your minds. First and foremost is around extra loaders and the Trans-Pacific eastbound market. There were some headlines about BCOs getting involved, and we have all kinds of good information on that. Secondly, you've asked about just, hey, what are the ongoing issues in Yantian and around the world with major disruptions, and when might those get resolved? And what are some things that we could do to try and minimize that disruption? And then finally, we've got actually a really big exporter base of listeners. And so there have been some things in the headlines, especially at kind of the government levels of things happening around exports that we'll talk about. But, Don, before we get into the topics, was there anything that you saw in the feedback this week that you want to address or elaborate on?
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say thanks for listening. It's great to see the engagement from our listeners, and I love to see the posts on LinkedIn. So first of all, a big thank you to everyone who's listening, and keep the comments coming because that helps us give us some direction of what people want to hear us talk about. The first thing I just wanted to mention is that there was some comments around my statement that I had seen a rate quote of $22,000, or someone had told me that. I didn't actually see the rate itself. And there's some comments around some different numbers people are receiving. And I think that's great. I think that I'm not trying to suggest that all rates are at that level, but there are some carriers out there saying if it's incremental volume that it could be up to 22,000. That number actually has changed. I've seen a rate as high as 26,000, or I've heard of that. But again, I'm sure there's rates moving below that. And we're not trying to say that you need to pay that much to move a container. And the point was really more around that the rates are getting so high and the service has never been worse. And I think recently Maersk was recognized as the most reliable carrier in the industry, but I think their on-time rate was something around 48%. So now there's different reasons for that. You look at what's happening with Yantian, there's congestion on the ports. I don't think you can point to the carriers and saying that they're willingly delaying their ships. Not at all. I think there's just enough disruption in the market that's making it very difficult for carriers to operate on time.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Great way to kind of sum that up. Anything else that you saw out there?
There was one other comment regarding, I was talking about should carriers engage in shorter term quarterly deals, and there was some comment around like, hey, most carriers I talk to are overcommitted. So how would something like that work? And I do think that's true. I think that there is a certain amount of overcommitment in certain directions, but I also see that there are certain premium products that are still being offered. As I mentioned, there's this $26,000 rate hanging out there. Now, I think if you're able to commit somewhere longer, to me, it would make sense that, okay, 26,000 seems like it's very spot and might be for a given week. But to come up with a program to say, well, I'm going to guarantee a certain volume at a certain rate level on a specific service, and it would have to be very specific. It would have to be one origin to one destination. But do I think something like that could work? I think it can work. I think what needs to happen, though, is that some of these things that I mentioned earlier about what you're seeing happening in Yantian is just exacerbating those things that have been happening on the West Coast with all this congestion. So is the environment difficult? Sure. Do I think there's an opportunity? Well, the opportunity to me exists as long as you can offer some sort of premium program and say that I'm going to allow someone to get on the ship at a certain price point at a certain time. That means to me that there's some capacity there and there's some ability to commit over a prolonged period.
Yeah. Well, and again, maybe this is a good transition point into our first topic around, one of those opportunities may be, an extra loader, either, one specific, single shot extra loader, or maybe a series of extra loaders that may become available. I think a lot of the listeners would love to hear your perspective around. Well, again, if things are oversubscribed, where the heck could they go find ships, right? We've already talked about if you place an order for a ship, it takes a couple of years, and we've heard for months, hey, there's no ships, there's no containers. How in the world could this be? But I think one of the things that grabbed a lot of the headlines is a major BCO, right? A top, three importer, actually came out and said that, we've got a charter ship that is committed to us for the month of July. It's going to be 100% ours, and we're doing it because it's just one of the unusual actions that we have to take, right, to kind of overcome some of these significant disruptions in the global supply chain. And well, I think people have known there have been extra loaders, but this idea of one BCO, right, contracting for an entire ship, I think certainly caught people's attention. But before we talk about what that specifically means, maybe you touch on just where would these ships even come from?
Yeah, and to put it in context, there's some things happening, and I captured some information that I've heard as far as extra loaders. So, for example, Hyundai has said they're going to have 4 extra loaders in each of the next 2 months. Their O&E has announced that they're going to have some extra loaders. There's 2 lines, BAL Container Line and China United Container Line. They're talking about starting a TP eastbound service. They've never operated in the trade before, but now they're looking to shift there. SM Lines said they're starting extra loaders as soon as next week. So, and there's some question of where do these ships come from? Well, my sense is that for some carriers, it might make sense to blank a sailing in another trade and redeploy that asset in a trade where you can make more money. And I think that's just an economics game. If you see that your yields are lower in a trade, it helps the carrier in that if they blank a sailing and take out a sailing for a week, that helps them drive up demand, which again, there's a correlation between supply, demand, and price, obviously. But now you can redeploy that asset and put it in a trade where the yields are much higher, and you can effectively blank sailings in other trades and figure out ways to still manage your network there and provide a reliable service, but also take advantage of helping the TP eastbound trade, because I do think that trade does need help. There's so much of a backlog there, and that's what's driving some of these unprecedented prices, that there is relief needed. And that's why you're seeing carriers try and do this, because on the charter market, I think is pretty tough. What I've heard is about $150,000 a day. And the chartering companies want a longer term agreement. They're not going to say, take the ship for 2 months and then you're gone. They obviously want to take advantage of the market and say, if you're going to take the ship, well, now you got to take it for a prolonged period. So it's something that carriers have to manage. I think carriers can figure out ways, and I think it makes sense if there's rates available at a $20,000-ish level, that you're going to find ways to make it work. So I think that makes total sense that it's happening.
So okay, so these ships and equipment coming from other trades could be a temporary fix, or at least some temporary infusion of capacity into the eastbound market, which could certainly help. Now, obviously, again, this big importer certainly made the headlines, but I guess the other question is do you have to be right one of those big importers to get access to some of this additional capacity that could be coming in? I think probably it helps because there's critical mass, and it probably reduces risk on both sides. That says, hey, we can run this ship in limited port pairs and we could probably fill it pretty quickly. But I'd love to get your perspective. I mean, do you have to be a big guy, or are there going to be opportunities for others on this?
I think there's going to be opportunities for others. I mean, I think certainly the big guys have the volume density to fill up a big portion of that ship, but I don't think you're only going to turn to that market because I think the pain is felt everywhere. And again, my sense is that carriers do want to improve their service levels to their customers and help with this incremental volume that's there. So there's this idea around helping mid-size, small-size shippers. I think the problem is there's just so many of them and it's hard to capture all of them. I don't think one carrier can take care of all of them, but I think there's enough things happening that there will be opportunities to have some relief here in the near term for everybody.
Well, I think, just, speaking from some of my perspective in history and doing some of this and working at a big BCO and retailer in the past, one of the questions that I saw that wasn't clear was, did the BCO actually go out and charter the ship on their own, or did they work through a carrier to do it? And while those details aren't available, and we really don't want to speculate on it, what I would just tell you is to me what makes the most sense is to work through an existing carrier if you can do that. If you're big enough and you have the size to do that, I mean, at the end of the day, BCOs are focused on something else. A lot of these guys are retailers. They're trying to get products to customers and they're trying to run a business. This idea of trying to actually manage ships and equipment and get berths at ports and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I just don't see the administrative overhead, the expertise to be able to kind of manage that. And the other thing is it just, the time and the cost that would go into just, obviously in most cases it's a one-way type of business opportunity. I doubt if a BCO is going to go out and have much export volume to backhaul it, and fuel costs. I just think about all the complexities. I mean, it sounds easy, right, to just charter a ship and load it up and send it from China to the U.S., but I don't think it's that easy. So that's probably some of the things I think about. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think, I mean, frankly, I love the idea that top importer chartered a ship because that's something different. And I think that the industry needs to change. I don't think there's too many people sitting around here saying, wow, I think the industry needs to change, stay the same, because I think you look at the past 10 years, excluding the past 12 months, and say, it's this vicious cycle where it was a buyer's market or a shipper's market, and you could move around without consequence. You could change carriers. You could not honor your contracts. And that, I think, at times drove rates to an extremely low level. I mean, a 3-digit level. And now you look at it, it's completely shifted the other way. And when it shifts the other way, it doesn't feel much better either, right? Now you're at 5-digit rate level. So not too long ago, you had rates that were 3 digits. Now you have rates that are 5 digits. I mean, it's just so extreme, right? And I think that most people would say this can't continue. So when you look at things like, hey, I'm going to charter my own ship, sure, that's a function of the current demand and what's happening in the industry, but it's also something that's different. And I think I like the idea of companies working together to find solutions that aren't the same. I'm going to do things differently. And it's just the way the industry is changing, because I think that's a positive sign that the industry is starting to change. Because again, a lot of these things have existed for a very long time, and there's definitely a need to change the industry.
Yeah. Well, it's going to take a lot of collaboration and work together to do it, right? Again, just from history and doing these things, if you're used to shipping, say, a couple hundred TEUs, right, per ship, and now you're going to go up to a couple of thousand TEUs, and you're going to try and do it in one shot, right? The internal coordination with your sourcing organization and your vendors and your suppliers, and getting all that equipment loaded in that short window of time, at whatever origin it is, obviously loading it on the ship, and then once it gets here, right, now you've got to consume a couple thousand containers that come off the ship in one shot. Do you have the port drayage to do it? Do you have the domestic, transportation to do it? All those things happen because I'm pretty sure that carrier is going to want that equipment turned pretty quick so it could get back on the ship, right, and head back for another voyage, which you as a shipper should want too, right? You might want another shot, at it. So, it definitely requires a lot of coordination and thought. And then there's also, again, you just have to talk to the risk aspects. There's certainly a reward if it works out. You've moved a lot of cargo in a short period of time, probably at an elevated rate level. But hey, if the main thing is getting, your inventory replenished, then it works out. But this idea of saying now I do have a risk exposure. I have a whole lot of freight on one ship. Should something happen, right, to that ship? Should it get delayed somewhere? Should something happen to it? Now from an insurance, premium perspective, my marine insurance that I have may cover a certain degree, but does it cover that on one shot? So there's all kinds of things. It's not a silver bullet, but I agree with you. With proper planning and coordination, it could be a really effective solution.
Yeah, I think the one thing around like this chartered service and, these other services that are coming in, extra loaders, the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is that, we already have quite a bit of congestion out on the West Coast, that there's some 14 ships still at anchor. So there's still a backlog outside of LA. You look at what's happening in Yantian. So Yantian is improving. So there's been reports that they've improved from 70% to 50% of normal, depends on which side you're talking about. And prior to that, it was 45%. But there's still a tremendous backlog. And there's some 400,000 TEUs a week that move out of the port of Yantian, which is just huge. And when you take half of that out of the market for a couple of weeks, there's bound to be an effect. So it is concerning to think about, where's this stuff going to go? I mean, it's great to see that there's capacity coming available. That's terrific because the demand requires it. But what kind of effect does that have on the supply chain? And, we talked earlier about how, if you're 50% reliable, you're one of the best in the industry right now in terms of reliability. But I don't think that's a sustainable number. And I don't see that improving with some of these things that are happening as far as extra loaders and other carriers coming online.
Well, and I think that's a good way to talk about not just Yantian, but any other disruptions that are out there. And again, if you do have a ship, it might not be able to even go to the port that you want it to. Say you want your charter ship to go to Yantian, and you might not be able to get into Yantian for the next month. And this speaks to how resilient and how quick can you react to these things, right? So a lot of shippers, of course, when Yantian shuts down, hey, can you convert to another port in South China? Can you go to Hong Kong? Can you do this? Can you do that? Or can you shift production from South China up to Central or Northern China? There's all those things that come back to this resiliency and this redundancy or diversification in terms of your approach. Because you're right. I mean, when I was trying to quantify some of the Yantian disruption components, I just started doing my own research. And again, we've talked about Lars Jensen, who's been on the podcast a number of times and, typically is pretty good at estimating these things. And, he said upwards of 600,000 TEUs, to this point has been impacted, and over 300 sailings will probably be omitted, right, by the time this thing is done. And you think about all of the press and the headlines that the Ever Given, being jammed up in the Suez Canal got, but this actually could be even bigger than that and didn't get near the headlines.
Yeah, and it's, I think there's so many things happening. You look at these extra loaders, you look at the port congestion, and then you look at like some of the economic factors. So I think one of the things that got some headlines is that retail sales actually dropped in May. So it was 1.3% lower than April. And, there's people that might say like, oh, wow, the market's slowing down. Well, that may be true, but if you consider that, where February, March, and April were in terms of their growth factors, I think they are fairly significant, in fact, record highs. And you look at certain segments like automotive and electronics, that some of that reduction was impacted by a lack of supply, that there just wasn't enough product there to fill the demand. Now, what I understand is that there's certain segments like home goods and things like that actually declined. And is that a function of the stimulus checks have been spent? They were sent out earlier in the year. Does that mean that tastes are starting to shift from goods to services now that things seem to be opening up? I mean, Most places I go now, you're not required to wear a mask anymore. So it feels like things are starting to open up and relax. And does this represent a shift now in spending patterns? And does this have implications now for what's going to happen in the supply chain? Well, I don't think we can point to any one indicator today, which is going to say that things are starting to change. But I think it's something to keep your eye on because there could be the start of things starting to slow down as far as this demand for goods that we've seen over the past year.
Well, I think it's a good point. This is where you've got to read more than the headline because, as you said, right, the headline could mask really what's happening, underneath. So, yeah, May fell 1.3%, right, from April. But to your point, April was the highest month on record for retail sales. So, even though May fell, it was still 28% higher than last year and the second highest month on record, right? I mean, so there's still a ton of strength out there, without a doubt, that is going to continue to drive imports for the foreseeable future. And yeah, I think if you do look inside the numbers, you start to see that, money spent at bars and restaurants increased 1.8%. If you look at the category over a 3 month period, it's up 70%. Now, again, we know last year there was nothing happening, right? So you got to take those numbers with a grain of salt. But I still think, to your point, it's early indicators, right, that start to show you that as people get vaccinated, as you said, and feel more comfortable, some of those spending patterns shift. But I think one of the things that you and I have talked about before is you then even have to look one level deeper that says even if spending patterns start to shift, this idea of consuming goods starts to slow, although it still looks really, really strong. And we know we're going into a holiday period of the year. You've got back to school, you've got your fall, Halloween, and harvest, you've got Thanksgiving, Christmas, and then you're right into the new year and you're back into Chinese New Year. I'm not sure how much it drops off, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you say to yourself, okay, maybe it is starting to change, but I don't think I can let my foot off the gas if I'm still trying to get capacity and I'm still trying to protect myself from here to the end of the year. While maybe things relieve a little bit, I still think it's going to be pretty tough.
Yeah. And here's my guess is that things are going to improve with extra loaders and slowing demand, slowing from record levels, not slowing to a screeching halt. And the result of that is that this $26,000 rate I talked about earlier isn't going to be the requirement anymore. Now, is it still a 5-digit number? Maybe. It sounds like there's a tremendous backlog out there. And I don't think anyone should start to think like, oh, problem's going to be solved in the second half of the year. I don't think so. But do I think it's going to be as chaotic as it is now? I don't think so. But again, think about all the disruptions we've had with the Ever Given, Yantian, port congestion, you name it. There's been a lot of issues there. So there's a lot of improvement that's required in the shipping industry before we can sit there and say like things are back to normal, whatever new normal looks like, but to a version of normal.
Well, I think you're right, and I hope we get there. But again, this idea of saying, hopefully there isn't another COVID breakout, somewhere else that's at a critical component of the supply chain. So you don't have the ripple effects of Yantian. I mean, some of the estimates I've heard on the carrier side is saying it's taken 20 to 25% of their capacity out, right? And to your point, once that's gone, it's gone. And now you've got to try and find a way to catch up. Hopefully the extra loaders do it. If again, demand drops off a bit, but the last piece of the component is just looking at what's the backlog and what are just relative inventory levels anyway, right? So I think when you look at inventory levels still being at record lows, right? Because pretty much everything that's been coming in, even though it's record imports, is getting sold, right? I mean, it's not like it's going into inventory to be sold at a future date. It's literally flowing right through some of these warehouses or cross docks and going directly to the sales floor. So you haven't really replenished inventory levels. So you've got that plus a backlog. I don't know, man. It's going to be interesting to see how it goes, but hopefully, right, some of these things do settle and it at least makes it where it's manageable for shippers and carriers to your point, bring some predictability back and reliability to everyone's operation.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is probably a good point to start to talk about other implications too, because I think there's an export implication.
And so you know me, right? I start to move to just the practical implications, right? Again, if I'm a shipper on the exporter side, I start to think about all the things that we've been talking about from an importer's perspective, right? That says, hey, you've got to be easy to do business with. You can't hold on to containers for weeks at a time. You've got to pay a fair and reasonable rate. You've got to make commitments. You've got to plan better. You've got to do all those things. And hey, look, I understand. I know sometimes managing up in your supply chain and predictability is hard. But this is where you're going to have to do that tough work with your stakeholders that says, look, for us to be in a position to take advantage of what capacity is going to be available to us, here are all the things that we're going to have to do to position ourselves to be, more of this kind of customer of choice on the export side. And I hate to say that, right? Because it is a lot of work and it is a lot of effort. But I think if you want any chance, there's going to be certain parameters that you're going to have to kind of fit within from a carrier perspective for them to consider your business. Well, and here's the other component about being a customer of choice, and we're really careful, Don. I mean, we work for the New York Shipping Exchange, but our podcast isn't about selling our service. It's about actually talking about things that are important to shippers and carriers, creating collaboration and an environment where people can work together to improve efficiency. And if committed agreements helps with that, great. But I think it's worth sharing that a lot of the early adoption within NYSHEX was on the export side of the business, right? And exporters found value in these two-way committed agreements in terms of protecting their interests, right, with these carriers who, again, maybe weren't as focused on them as a business partner. I'd love to get your perspective on, as this is happening, yes, they're going to get help, but do two-way committed agreements help with that process? And how do they use that to their advantage?
Yeah, I absolutely think two-way commitments help because it gives carriers an understanding of where the containers are going to be moved from, where they're going to go to, and what those parameters are. I mean, the problem with current contracts is that they're ambiguous. If I sign a contract for 10,000 TEUs or 500 TEUs, or I give you a rate matrix, what does that mean in terms of volume? Where are you going to go from? Where are you going to go to? And it's just hard to manage. And you think about if I'm a carrier and I have extra loaders coming in, I have to build up equipment density in order to support those extra loaders. I can't just go out and grab enough equipment to support that ship. So if extra loaders are consuming equipment supply, then you can see where you're going to get the containers from. Well, you're going to get them from where you have a surplus. And the U.S. is typically a deficit that it's 3-to-1 right now, the ratio of imports to exports. So, the containers have to come from somewhere. So if you have a two-way commitment, however, I feel like that's a much more solid solution because you're actually helping the carrier by saying, this is how much I'm going to do. This is how much I'm going to deliver each week. This is where it's going to come from. This is the rate we're going to agree to. That's something that the carrier doesn't have oftentimes, right? And this helps them manage their assets better. So there's wins for the carriers there by customers being able to do that.
Well, and I think from a customer side, right? So now you actually have the specific performance framework to hold people accountable and to kind of truly have a compliance or accountability program. I mean, today, shippers want to go to the FMC and they want to talk about, hey, my contracts aren't being honored, they aren't being committed to. And if you're the FMC, you have the ability to look at that contract and it says, you're going to move 10,000 TEUs over the course of 12 months. And there's a rate and, port pair appendix, and that's it. There's no specificity that says what that carrier's obligation is as to how they're going to move that 10,000 TEUs over that 12-month period or from what port pairs. And so the idea of having this specific performance framework that says it's going to move from these port pairs at this, volume level, whether it's on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, there's a specific default structure in place, and now you have performance data to show what actually happened. You want to go to a regulator or the FMC and you want to plead your case. That's probably a much stronger case than this gray or ambiguous contract that really no one can interpret.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most clear examples we could give our listeners is if you think about, for the sake of ease, a 5,200 TEU contract. So you're talking about 100 TEUs a week. And let's just say that it's July and I show up to Brian at the carrier and I'm like, hey, Brian, I want my 100 TEUs a week. Well, what happens when Brian looks at my past performance and says, hey, Don, you've had this contract since May 1st. you've only shipped 50 TEUs a week until now. Why do I have to give you 100 now? And this is the dilemma, is that a carrier doesn't know, is the shipper contracting and using that formula to say, well, my maximum number is going to be 100. So I want to basically agree to an MQC of 100 to get that for a short period of time? Or is it something I'm actually going to deliver 100 a week? And I think, is it ever clean enough to be 100 a week? No. I think there's some range there, up and down. But the swings that you see from the carrier side are fairly significant. And this is why when you have clearer terms up front, it creates a ton of value for the carrier, because now they have better transparency and they can manage it better. It's not a matter of, I'm just going to show up at some point with this number. And again, if you're talking about getting a regulator involved, what am I supposed to do if I'm the FMC? For 8 weeks, you've been delivering 50 and now you want 100. Is the carrier obliged to do that? Well, it's complicated.
Yep. Well, hey, look, obviously we have our perspective. There's a lot of export shippers that use our product and others, from a committed standpoint, that have publicly spoken about how they incorporate it and how it benefits them. I know that there was quite a bit of discussion in some of the breakouts and even main sessions in TPM this year. And I know I've seen testimonials and other things out there. So if anybody wants to find out more information about it, there's plenty of ways to go do that.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that was a great discussion today, Brian. I think that's a wrap. So thanks again for a great show, Brian. And really a big thank you to our listeners. Please contact us on social media. You can DM us. Feel free to reach out anyway. We love to have your feedback. It's very helpful for us. And again, wherever you get your podcast, whether it's Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find it, don't forget to rate us, like us, and we'll continue to produce great content for you. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.